Once again, good morning and welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church. For all of those who are joining us, we continue our lecture series on Anglicanism 101, what is Anglicanism? And today we're going to be talking about the Celtic influence on Great Britain as it relates to early Christianity. And I have to say I'm kind of surprised that Teresa is not here. This was the question that she asked about the relationship between Celtic Christianity and Great Britain. Before we begin, one more reminder. This is not going to be some comprehensive analysis into the history of Great Britain, early or otherwise. The point that we are going to address, what is going to be our focus, is how Christianity was developing, and that it was developing long before Rome ever arrived on the scene. So the intent is to show that Anglicanism, and I'll put it in scare quotes depending upon how you define it, Anglicanism was already an established faith within the UK before the 7th century, which was when Rome arrived. Now, Christianity might have been advancing in Ireland with St. Patrick doing his work, leading snakes out of Ireland and all. But in Great Britain, in England itself, it essentially was forced into retreat. The early 5th century, we see Rome, the military Rome, the government, had essentially abandoned the UK. They left. And by leaving, they removed their imprint on Great Britain. And when that occurred, it creates a vacuum, and the country was rapidly overrun by the invading armies, the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. Essentially, all representations of the Germanic tribes. What winds up happening is Christianity, as the Germanic tribes arrive on the eastern coast of the UK, Christianity is driven west. And if you look at that map that I gave you, what you will notice is that large white section in the map. And if you pay close attention, that essentially is the preponderance of UK land area. I'll leave Scotland to the Scots. But as you can see, the main areas in Great Britain, and when we say main, obviously we're talking about Manchester, London, Edinburgh, etc., all by this point had been overrun by the Germanic tribes. Christianity retreated to the west. And you can see Ireland, Scotland, Wales, that little area between Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, the Isle of Man, and then there's Cornwall, and of course a very interesting little section right there on the western region of northern Gaul, called Brittany. So for the next 100 years, we're talking very little Christian influence in southern and eastern Great Britain. Now it seems that there are and there were isolated pockets of Celts who had been Christianized in places like Elmont, which is immediately east of Leeds. And this area is protected by major rivers coming down by the Humber estuary. So in other words, what you see are little areas of individuals hiding out. For the most part, Christianity then simply retreated westward with the Celts. Unfortunately, the Celts, it seems, were not happy with their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, and we see this specifically in the Arthurian, there we go, tales of the red dragon versus the white dragon, representing the Anglo-Saxons. Now, there was a very, very hostile attitude remaining from the Celts. The remaining, quote-unquote, Britons wound up incurring most of this dissatisfaction from the Celts. For their part, the Anglo-Saxons were like, what do we have to do with you guys? We already beat you. So we must see that the southern and eastern Britain, reverting in large measure to German paganism. Woden conquered the day. Christianity then was hanging on reasonably successfully in the West. Although, through certain authors like Gildas, there were a few more things to be said about the quality of those who were who were bishops at this time. And what happens then during the rest of the 6th century, the 500s, is that the Britons are slowly pushed westward, and for this reason there is a series of, and one of the reasons is there's a series of poor harvests. There were bad weather, there was famine, starvation, there were epidemics of diseases, and there was a general decline in population driving everybody to the west. And the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons took great advantage of this, I guess you would call it, Celt flight. From the church's standpoint, the question becomes, well, what are we supposed to do then? How are we supposed to interact with Great Britain? So, as Gregory arrives on the scene, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but as Gregory arrives on the scene, the plan becomes, let's use the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, let's get into their mind, if you will, and use them to convert the rest of the Germanic tribes. This is allegedly the plan. And this involves the arrival in Kent, the ministry of St. Augustine from the monastery of St. Andrews in Rome in 596. So we're already now moving into the 7th century. So I just wanted to throw that in so that you could see that there was, in some sense, a plan to deal with what was taking place. Christianity was looking at how to address this pagan influence. So, essentially, the Brits were either conquered and they were absorbed into the new society and culture, they became pagans, or they fled westward and settled in the mountains of Wales or among the Cornish Tors, T-O-R-S. Anybody know what that is?
The mound. Mound.
Well, rock formations, yes. They're hiding in the clefts of the rock. The West then became a stronghold for the church, and it continued to exist. And we know this from Gildas, who was a writer at the time, and he wrote the Exeditio et Conquesta Britannia. Make sure you get that down, spell it correctly, which basically means the execution and conquest of Britain. So Gildas was writing this from Wales about 535. He was ruthless in his criticism of British clergy. and he described them as such. Unworthy wretches, wallowing after the fashion of swine in their old and unhappy puddle of intolerable wickedness. You just like you like guys that are measured in their criticism. Well, that was Gildas. I mean, he just went after British clergy. However, and this is important to note, his picture of bishops was very, very different. There isn't the chaos amongst bishops that there is with the clergy. Bishops are organized. They hold their synods, to which their clergy are summoned and supposed to attend. Not much has changed today. And there are monasteries where some kind of rule, education, and perpetuation of the faith is kept. So Gildas had a much, much more positive view of episcopacy and bishops than anyone in this room, apparently, and than he did with the clergy. The British Church also had its share of saints. One of the most famous was Saint David. And he was, what? I'm sorry? Someone else?
Wales.
Okay. Only one of 4 patron saints of the islands was a native of the country. So Saint David was approximately circa 520 to 588. And he was a typical Celt abbot bishop. Now remember, last week we talked about what the Celtic view of the relationship between an abbot and a bishop was. Today we see bishops as the episcopal overseer and the abbot as a subordinate in that authority structure, whereas the Celts viewed the abbot as he was the big man on campus, and bishops were there simply to ordain. That was it. So St. David, as a representative, was very evangelical. He was a founder of various monasteries and was supported by other Christian saints at this time, such as St. Illtyd, Illtyd, gotta love the British in their spelling, who was St. David's teacher, and St. Deniol, Deniol, as well as some others. So while England, Woden and Thor had essentially usurped Christ in the east and the south, Wales kept the church light burning. Now, even cut off as it generally was from the rest of Christendom, it still managed to stem the pressure of paganism from without and from within. Now, isolation, however, came with a cost. Now, if you look at that map, you can see why we're talking about Christianity being isolated from the main body of the country. Can you give this to Teresa? Yeah. Notice where the primary emphases of Christianity falls. Northern Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany. Notice it's all on the exterior, which, when you look at an island, creates isolation. So there is a challenge here for the church. There was a tendency for the church to become insular and very self-absorbed. This is why monasteries took, in many cases, a very strange turn at some points. Whereas originally it was I'll use the term, an institution that was designed to advance the faith, to educate, to minister to the community. When you're in this type of hostile environment where all around you is the enemy, you develop this radical us-them mentality, and you wind up becoming very, very introspective. So with all of this, the self-absorption and the insular nature of the church, according to Bede, it made no attempt to convert the Anglo-Saxons. And the true missionary zeal then didn't come from Wales. The true missionary zeal within Great Britain at this time came from Ireland. And with that, we introduce Saint Columba, which I mispronounced for the first 20 years of my life. I'm Italian, so he was Saint Columbo. I got one question, I don't understand. Anyway, so the Irish church and its life continues to develop, with the monastery remaining the center of the organizational structure and activity, even after the death of St. Patrick in the 5th century, 461. The monastery was attached, let me rephrase that. The monastery at Morville, that St. Columba was involved with, shows up on the scene at this time. St. Columba was the son of Phelim, P-H-E-L-I-M, of the royal house of Niall, N-I-A-L-L, of the 9 hostages. Now, those are all incidentals. I mean, if you want to write them down, that's fine. Just know that St. Columba becomes a very important figure at this time. He was born in 521. He was at first known as Saint Column, just C-O-L-U-M, not column as on a page. And that designation was Column the Dove. However, he was anything but. His character had more the quality of an eagle. He was tall, he was vigorous, he was broad-shouldered, he was tempestuous. He, according to reports, had a voice of thunder and could strike terror into the heart of any who openly defiled him. About 560 AD, there was a petty dispute over which there are still 3 different explanations as to why this occurred, and none of them really are satisfactory. There was a dispute that arose over a manuscript that was developed wound up developing into a quarrel in which whole tribes wound up getting involved in a war. And this led to the battle of, and I cannot pronounce this, but it led to the battle of Culdreihne, C-U-L-D-R-E-I-H-M-N-E.
One more time.
C-U-L-D-R-E-I-H-M-N-E, in which Columba led his troops into battle. And Column the Dove killed 3,000 of his enemy. Not surprising when you consider the actual nature of the man. So, because of this, as the churches want to do when it sees somebody this brutal, they essentially rejected him and they forced him to leave the country. So in 56, AD 563, he left with 12 of his companions and they sailed to Ionia, right off the southwestern section of Scotland. Small island off the coast. On the eastern shore of the island, immediately opposite Mull, M-U-L-L, they built a monastery, which is what Celts do. They show up and they build monasteries. And they built it after the usual Celtic pattern. It was a refractory of wood, bunch of beehive huts, and there was an encircling wall to protect the whole enclosure. It had no resemblance to the Gaul, Frankish monasteries made of stone and brick, etc. They brought with them, when they developed this monastery, they brought with them familiar Irish life. Hard, simple, austere. They tilled the soil, they fished, they copied manuscripts, and of course, daily prayer and praise was conducted. Iona soon then became a center from which missionary journeys were undertaken both to the mainland of Scotland and to the Isle of Hebrides. Columba ministered here after being exiled for 30 years. And there are numerous legends of his miraculous healings and blessings. But he also was engaged in missionary journeys. Southern Scotland appears to have already accepted some form of Christianity, so that it was to the unconverted northern Picts that Columba directed his energies. Now, I'm going to pause just for a second because I want you to see what's going on. You notice that there is an incursion. There's a reaching out of Christianity already beginning before Augustine arrives with Gregory's plan of, the Northern Campaign. So Christianity is starting to push back, and it's starting to push back through Columba. It's starting to push back through a Celtic influence. Now at this point, Columba is in Aberdeen, the Orkneys. But his greatest triumph, and this becomes significant for long-term historians, was the conversion of King Brude, B-R-U-D-E, at Inverness.
Inverness.
Whatever. He won victory after victory over the Druids. Keep it up. Keep it up. You argue with the man with the mic, and I can promise it'll be worse for you. Columba eventually died in 597, the 9th of June, at the age of 76. However, by this time, essentially a year earlier, Augustine had landed in Kent and the conversion of England was underway. But note, two major regions now are being influenced. The southern, eastern section, London, Canterbury, etc., and the northern section, and western, Wales, Ireland, Scotland. The northern section is primarily Celtic in its representation of Christianity, and the southeastern section is a mixture. A little bit of paganism, a little bit of German influence, and the approach of Rome at this point. In many ways, Columba's monastery was what we would consider an early university, a place where all kinds of ideas were studied, they were debated, there was the copying of manuscripts that would have been of prime importance at this time, just as it was in Celtic monasteries, specifically back in Ireland at Kildare, Clonfert, and I don't even Clonmacnoise. It's Clonmacnoise, Mickey Mouse. So Clonmacnoise, that's the closest I can. Miss Celtic expert, you want to tell me how to pronounce that?
Spell it again.
No. Clonmacie. Now, the fact that I had to respell that means you don't know how to pronounce it. You're just going to take a stab at it. Okay. Pardon me?
I do know how to pronounce Hebrides. There you go.
Okay. Good for you. Give that lady a cookie. She can pronounce everything. So, his fame spread far and wide, and new scholars and pilgrims sought out Iona because this had been Columba's island. In fact, Iona simply became, this is an interesting observation, it became so busy and so sought out that it became too noisy and too loud for the monks. And they had to leave. There was at this time something that was developed that became one of the greatest treasures of the Celts. And it was created on Iona. Who was it? Go ahead. Come on, Teresa.
Book of Kells.
Book of Kells.
I've seen it. It's gorgeous.
Good for you. It was
Bite me.
too hairy. It was I guess I'm going to have to edit that later.
Now children.
Well, it's too late. It's already live. Well, nobody's ever going to watch these again. It was only after it was completed that the book was taken from the island back. From the island back to Ireland because of the Viking raids. They were supremely aware of the Celts, mind you, of the suffering of early Christians and what early Christianity had experienced for their faith. When the gospel was brought first to Ireland, there was an expectation. Note this, because this is very much endemic to the psyche of the early church in general. And by early, I mean all the way back to the first century. When the gospel was first brought to Ireland, there was an expectation that those who carried the new faith would be persecuted and eventually killed. Martyrdom became a badge, not only of honor, but a badge of the proof of your faith. And it's at this time where that bizarre mindset developed, which wound up becoming permeated in early Rome, or wound up permeating early Rome, and early Roman thought that if you didn't die a martyr's death, you were less a Christian. There was something deficient about your Christianity. Because if you are truly sharing the gospel to a fallen pagan world that hates Christ, they're going to kill you. That's how that mindset developed.
How did they square that with John? Did he die a natural death?
John was not intended to die a natural death. If you'll remember, he was exiled to Patmos. They were intending
No, they wanted
to kill him. Yeah, the intent was to kill him. But what eventually wound up happening with John was that his reputation and his fame became so great that Rome feared an uprising. And they didn't want to have to deal with another Masada. They didn't want to have to deal with another round of mass persecutions. Even though Vespasian and Decius is on he's on the horizon. Diocletian is on the horizon. Domitian is on. All of these guys that start persecuting Christians are all on the horizon at this point, post Nero, with Titus and Vespasian. There they were starting to go, okay, this is not working out the way we want, leave John alone. But John was intended to die a martyr's death.
So that counted if you were intended to die.
Well, I mean, what do you mean, what do you
Well, you
mean
were saying their
counted?
expectation of martyrdom was spreading through, and that they, if you didn't die a martyr, you weren't considered a good Christian. But John did not die a martyr, so I was just wondering how they squared that.
Well, you're looking at it 2,000 years hindsight, and you're imposing a concept today. Back then, they would have been more focused upon who John was as an individual, the fact that he was the last remaining eyewitness apostle to Christ. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that he probably would have been cut some slack. Because yes, the intent was, well, it wasn't his intention, but the intent was to martyr him. So in that sense, they would have looked at John's ministry and they would say, oh yeah, look, he's ticking them off so much that they want to kill him. But God has spared him because he has not died, you know what I mean? So that's the way it would have been viewed, which is not necessarily an exaggeration. He did spare him. He just died in exile. He died in isolation. He was in exile on Patmos, but when they brought him back to Ephesus, that's when he died in isolation. But for the Celts, that didn't always happen. Not everybody was martyred. And even though that was the view, and even though there was this transitioning to more testimony than martyrdom, the more that the Celts kept pushing, the more the faith became entrenched and accepted in the area, and their witness became, I don't want to exaggerate, but it became incredibly powerful. And at this point, martyrdom, evangelism, the sharing of the gospel, and the preaching of the word all wound up getting folded into their belief system. And I'm gonna stop, because the rest of that is a comment on contemporary Christianity, and we don't need to talk about that just yet. Next week, we're going to talk about St. Augustine, and we're going to get into Rome's appearance in the southeast. So, questions?
Just to follow on what you were saying, one of the stories that I read was many Celtic monks simply went into boats and cast themselves into the sea to take them wherever what was believed that God would take them. And wherever they landed, that was where they were going to spread the word. Most simply died out on the open water, never to be seen again. But you had this active faith that said, I'm going, and I'm going to go witness the gospel wherever the Lord takes me.
Yeah, the legends of Celtic martyrdom correspond in many ways to the legends of the martyrdom of early Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries. I don't know if you've ever read Butler's Lives of the Saints, but just for the sheer sake of existential force, I would suggest you read some of the accounts of Christians being brought into, and I'm going back to the 1st century, Christians being brought into the Roman arena and 3, 4, 6 at a time thrown in the center, and wild beasts would be released. And if you've ever watched any nature program, you know how pack animals hunt. They encircle and then they attack. And Christians, as the accounts go, wound up on their knees, praying and singing in the middle of these brutal attacks. Lions devouring their brethren right next to them while they're praying and they're singing. You read story after story of martyr in the early church, which was one of the reasons Tertullian said that the seed of the church is the blood of the martyrs. It's very difficult. I mean, well, today it's not, but it was very difficult at that time to see someone so connected to their faith, so immersed in their faith, that when they are tortured, when they are brutalized, they would put sacks on their head with rats, and the rats would devour their faces and their heads. Singing, praying. It's very hard to see that and hear somebody praying to Christ and not be affected as a pagan. It's just not. Well, look at the centurion at the foot of the cross. This truly was the Son of God. You know, and that people go back and forth, well, was he being sarcastic or whatnot? I don't think so. I think that was a legitimate expression of faith. Now, you can take it for what it's worth. I mean, we see, I believe it was Polycarp on his way. Mind you, he's traveling through Roman roads to his own execution, knowing he's going to die, witnessing as he's going along, writing his epistles as he's going along. And when he stood before the Roman governor, and he was told to recant, he was asked to recant 3 times, his final statement, anybody remember what he said? Said, for 86 years of my life, my Savior has never abandoned me. How can I abandon him? And he was executed. Martyrdom became incredibly powerful, and it became an incredible tool for evangelism, which is why we wound up developing this kind of skewed perspective on martyrdom in the early church. You know, what greater way to share Christ than to die for your faith? Today's context creates some challenges for us in that milieu. People wearing suicide vests and flying planes into buildings. They're martyrs for the faith. Now, we have an answer for that. However, when we look at the act in and of itself and we compare the two, it doesn't have the same impact today that it did back then. Any other questions? We got, you got 5 minutes.
What do you mean by it doesn't have the same impact today because of how we live in the West?
No, because of how martyrdom is viewed. Martyrdom to today is viewed as a terrorist, is viewed as it's linked to terrorism. In other words, you martyr yourself because you're killing infidels.
Well, certainly that's not our only view of it, though.
Well,
I mean, that's the Muslim view.
it may not be your view of it, but you would be hard pressed to find literature today that talks of martyrdom in a way that we would equate as a positive correlation to the early church.
Wouldn't that be the people just killed, was it Sudan, where they beheaded 70 Christians?
That is true. There's no question. I'm not saying that it doesn't occur. I'm not saying that martyrdom does not occur today, and I'm not saying that there aren't real, and I hate to use the term legitimate, instances of martyrdom. I'm just saying that the general attitude today when we hear the word martyr automatically goes to a terrorist. It just does. I mean, you may know of somebody that doesn't do that, but even when I hear it, that's the first thing I think of. And I know better. But it's one of those terms that, because of the manner in which it is employed, in reality, changed its meaning. Yeah, I'll give you an example. The Greek word martyros, from which we get martyr. That's the word. Do you know what the lexical definition of martyr is? The martyros in Greek?
Witness.
Witness. That's all it means, is witness. But because the term became so closely associated with the early church and the Christians of the early church being executed for their witness, the meaning of the word changed. And that's the same thing that you see today with martyrdom. It went from witness to dying to being executed for what you believed, and now it went from being executed for what you believe to killing those who disagree with you, to voluntarily giving up your life to kill somebody who is opposed to your faith. Yeah. We don't have to accept that as the sole definition, but my contention is that primarily is the definition that we see today with that term.
Am I the only one that sees that?
Yes.
Probably so, yeah. But I think about the martyrs who are killed because they won't give up their faith, or they will reject Christ.
Yeah, that happened.
They're killed,
Yeah.
but they're not like the suicide bombers of the Japanese and.
Well, that's
and
good.
these-
Ross
yeah,
just pointed
but-
that out.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, that's different.
Well,
It's like you are willing to give your life up,
I-
but these guys are just killing themselves.
I did
because-
say that there was a difference.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm not saying that the two are identical. What I'm saying is that the meaning of the term has shifted predominantly to this political expression. There are still legitimate, I hate using that term in reference to this. There are still actual cases of martyrdom where Christians in Muslim lands are executed because they will not renounce Christ.
Right.
Look at what happens to a Muslim that renounces Christ. He's dead. I mean, it's over. They're dead. You don't even, there's not even a discussion. You get one shot, recant, no, okay. Whoop, off comes your head. Okay, next week we're going to talk, as I said, next week we'll get into the nitty-gritty of Rome showing up on the scene. But now it's time for morning prayer.